Hello and welcome. My name, if you didn't already know, is Nehemiah. I am 24. I recently graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology in undergraduate. And I have to say, I am so excited to be doing this. For basically my whole life, I have been trying to figure out all the things we as humans seem to care about. Like, how can I get what I want? How can I make friends? How can I get myself to do the things I know I should? Does my life even matter? How do I find someone for a romantic relationship? There are all these questions that we wrestle with. While I won't be directly answering those questions, by the end of this presentation, I'm hoping that you will have at least the beginning of understanding of how to answer those questions for yourself, with some degree of clarity and confidence. Because I feel like for so many of us, those questions are so ambiguous, and no matter who we ask, we can't seem to get any kind of really clear answer. So I want you to be able to get to a place where you feel really good about making decisions in your life because you feel like you know exactly why you're doing them and you have a really strong feeling about where you're going. Yeah, I hope that you learned so much. I hope that you come up with some great questions to ask me. If you're watching this the day that this comes out, I will be taking questions and answering them today at 3. Either you can message me and I'll set up a time for you to call between 3 and 4 for me to answer your question live, or you can just message me questions and I'll be answering a lot of those. So yeah, without any further ado, let's get into it. So to start, I actually have a few questions for you. You can pause the video for a second if you need to go get something to write with. And also, as I'm asking these questions, feel free to pause to give yourself as much time as you need to answer the questions. So, if you're ready, the first question is, how do you feel right now? Go ahead and write down 3 or more feelings that come to mind right now with regards to how you're feeling. Just kind of think about your emotions right now and how would you describe them if somebody walked in the room and was like, hey, how are you feeling right now? But they actually meant it. Once you've written down a few emotions that you feel like you're feeling right now, the next question I want to ask is, why do you think that you feel this way right now? What kind of things have influenced you recently so that your mood or your feelings or your emotions are where they're at right now? Did something happen recently? Did somebody do something to you? Did you eat something? Did you get enough sleep? What's going on in your life right now that caused you to feel the way that you are right now in this moment as you're starting to watch this video? And then the next question, and the last question, going even deeper, how do you feel about the fact that you feel the way that you do right now? So if you feel really happy, if that's one of the words you wrote down, are you glad that you feel happy? Or are you not happy that you feel happy? Or if you feel really stressed, are you glad that you feel stressed? Or are you frustrated that you feel stressed? Whatever it is that you're feeling right now, in the greater context of your life, is it a way that you want to be feeling a lot of the time or a way you don't want to be feeling a lot of the time? So again, how do you feel right now? And then how do you feel about the way that you feel? All right, if you've gotten those 3 written down, then we can get right into it. I called this a philosophy of everything. Or maybe more specifically, my philosophy of everything. It is pretty personal to me, as this is kind of based off of not just what I've learned in psychology, but it's largely based off of what I've learned about the world just through my own personal experiences with myself and paying attention to myself and paying attention to other people and having tons of conversations. So I call it a philosophy of everything because it's a framework for understanding everything a human being might ever want to know in their life. It's not answers for everything you want to know in life. I certainly don't have half the answers to a bunch of the questions I'll be asking or getting into, but I have a framework for starting down the path of inquiring and trying to figure out the answer to the questions that I have as a human being about my life and what I want to do as I'm living and breathing. So a lot of these questions. What is knowledge? Where does it come from? What should we do with it? Where do my feelings come from? You guys were just answering some of those questions, right? How do I make decisions in life? How do I treat others? What are the things in life that matter most? These are the questions I'm hoping to develop a framework for. Not answers for, just a framework for arriving at answering these questions. So, if you are a human being, this is for you. So whether you're a Christian or an atheist or a Muslim, whether you're liberal or conservative, anyone and everyone who believes anything about the world, if you're a living, breathing, thinking, and feeling human being, my whole point in creating this presentation is to be able to help you. And I also just kind of wanted to add in that a lot of the people, especially the day this comes out, who are watching this are going to be Christian. And I feel like there's a little bit of tension with me and some of my Christian friends because I'm not a Christian anymore. Most of you probably already know that at this point. And it's created a little bit of tension over the last year. And I think a lot of that tension comes from a bigger cultural conversation that tends to be pretty intense and very values-based. The militant atheists tend to be really aggressive against Christianity and against Islam and against religion as a whole concept. And they don't tend to be very respectful in the way that they go against that. They tend to be pretty dismissive and rude almost when they talk about it. They have a lot of condescension and derision in their tone when they talk about religion and Christianity especially. And then for the Christians, going the other way, there tends to be a reciprocation of the animosity of being extremely frustrated by the atheists who seem so bent on taking away the values or the representation of our values that we care about so much, of loving other people and bringing truth and morality into the world. And atheism seems to be the antithesis of that. But I personally don't think that it's that way. And I know that there are a lot of Christian friends and people I know that don't necessarily feel that way either. And I just kind of want to invite anybody, no matter who you are, again. As I'm presenting this, some of it's going to disagree with what you think about the world. Atheists are going to watch this and disagree with part of different parts of it. And I'm not trying to be right with this presentation about anything. In fact, this is a very, very rough rendition of my philosophy, and it is my hope that over the course of my life I will constantly be revising and changing this as I develop a better understanding of the world and as I meet new people and hear about other people's experiences. But when I come to places where it might disagree with what you believe, I know that as far as what I knew, or as far as my understanding went as a Christian, there are a lot of things in here that disagree very strongly with things that Christians might put forward as what's true about the world. But when I get to those places, don't just dismiss it outright and be frustrated that I'm disagreeing or going against what you believe. I hope that you can understand that in my developing this was my best attempt to understand my own life and my personal experience, and that I definitely still strongly value love and truth, and that this is my best ability to understand those things in the world. And if you're somebody who really cares about love and empathy and compassion and also about truth and hope, then please kind of try to see it from my angle and not be immediately dismissive of what I have to say, but really try to see where I'm coming from and try to understand it and see if maybe you could agree with me more than you think you did going into it. So, with that said, not only is my philosophy a philosophy of everything and a philosophy for everyone, but it is also a philosophy of wisdom. So, what is wisdom? Anybody who was raised Christian should have some vague idea at least of what wisdom is, and culturally we have some ideas of it. According to Google, of course the most trusted source of information, wisdom could be seen as the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. And then also, according to Oxford Online Dictionary, wisdom is defined as capacity of judging rightly in matters relating to life and conduct. And you read the whole definition if you want. But the idea here is that wisdom is kind of a little bit more intentional. It's not just about knowing what is and isn't true about the world, but it's about being discerning and finding something that actually matters as you're looking for truth and understanding. Within the Bible, and some of you might find this interesting again since I'm not Christian anymore, but I actually think that there's a ton of wisdom in the Bible, and while a lot of atheists tend to be very antagonistic toward the Bible, I actually think that if you don't look at it as like a holy book sent from God, but rather you look at it as writings from people in history who were trying to understand the world, there's a lot of really deep wisdom in what they were saying as they were experiencing life from their perspective. And one of the things that comes up in a lot of places in the Bible, and oftentimes these were some of my favorite parts of the Bible growing up, is where it talks about wisdom. And so here's a verse from Ecclesiastes 7. This is one of my all-time favorites. I remember this because I memorized this at one point. But it's like, where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value. The deep says, it is not in me, and the sea says, it is not with me. It cannot be purchased for gold, nor can silver be weighed for its price. From where does wisdom come? And where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living, and concealed from the birds of the air. And specifically within this chapter, wisdom is being compared in parallel to like gold and silver and precious stones, and how those things are hidden deep in the earth. And we as human beings go and we go down to the dark places where the birds of the air can't see, and we find things that are of value. And yet it's saying that we find gold and we find precious stones, but we still don't find wisdom. And there's just kind of this picture of like wisdom is not this really easy to find thing. Wisdom is this counterintuitive, hard to find, really valuable thing for human beings in their lives that is so important. And I think that if I was going to come up with a philosophy, it was going to be a philosophy of wisdom. It's a philosophy of like the really hard to understand things in life that are of great value to human beings. So I hope that my philosophy is of great value to you, if you are a human being listening and watching this. Here are a few other verses from the Bible on wisdom. Again, some of my favorites from the book of Proverbs and also from other parts of the book of Ecclesiastes. If you want to pause and read all of these, you can. Some of the things that it talks about with wisdom is that people who are people of wisdom tend to be of greater value to those around them. People tend to be really happy when they're in the presence of wise people, because wise people protect them and keep them safe, because wisdom contributes to life and well-being. And wisdom is also about turning toward morality and away from evil. And it's about not being prideful, but about being humble. And again, these are like words and ideas that we throw around all the time, but wisdom is really being able to understand what those mean. Because at face value, it's so easy for us to think we understand them, but a lot of times they're so much more complex than they look. And so wisdom is being able to understand their depth. So within the idea of it being a philosophy of wisdom, some of the ideas that I'm presenting hopefully will focus on being able to see past the obvious, being able to focus on the fact that what we think and what we feel presently isn't always immediately to be trusted. That like we should be hesitant and really critical in considering and thinking about what we think and what we feel and whether it can be trusted or not, or whether we should do some learning or investigation before we make a decision about doing something. We have so much to learn because life is extremely complicated. In fact, one of the fundamental pieces of wisdom is probably that there are no easy answers in life. And people who think that it's just this way or it's just that way always, that's not wise. And that's bound to get you hurt or other people hurt, because generally it's going to be a lot more complicated than that. And then getting what we want involves giving up things. So a lot of times it's really easy for people to just think that they can get what they want, especially when they're negotiating or dealing with other people who want different things than them. But the reality is that most of the time, no matter how hard we try, we generally have to pick something better over something good. And I know there are a bunch of like cliche sayings around that, but it's a reality that I don't think a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about, that a good life involves sacrifice, and being in relationships with other people involves a lot of sacrifice. And that's not a bad thing, but it's something that we have to be very attentive and critical to. And again, something that's complicated and is not generally straightforward and easy to figure out and understand or do right. So, over the course of this presentation, you will see this screen a lot and it's going to fill out as I go along, but the way that I'm doing this presentation is a little less linear than a normal presentation might go. I'm going to, what I like to say, lay ideas out on the table. So I'm going to put one idea out on the table, and then another idea, and then another idea, and sometimes the way they connect will make a lot of sense right away, and sometimes they won't. But by the end of the presentation, all of it will fit together to be able to complete the full idea and the full framework. So the first major piece that I just went over is that this philosophy is a philosophy of wisdom, and that wisdom is critical, and that it is essential and necessary for living a good life, but it is really hard to find, and we have to work really hard to find and have wisdom. So, next piece, my philosophy is a philosophy of vision. And this kind of stems out of the philosophy of wisdom, but vision is a very specific piece of wisdom when it comes to living life. So, here's a kind of synopsis or a definition of vision that I got from somebody's blog. His name is John Graham. And by the way, I'll have a document in the description for this video where you can access the links to the websites, and I think there's just a bunch of websites in one book that I used to gather some of the information for this presentation. So, according to John Graham, and I fully agree with how he put it, which is why I used this, but a vision is about focusing on the result that you want to achieve. It's about like thinking ahead very specifically and being like, this is exactly where I want to get. This is exactly what I want to see happen. And then once you establish where it is that you want to go, then you sit down and you make a strategy for how you're going to get there. And along the way, a lot of times the plans we make don't take us toward where we were wanting to go as directly as we originally thought. And so along the way, you constantly have to keep adjusting what you're doing in order to achieve the vision. But it's so easy to get caught up in what you're doing that you kind of forget about where you were actually trying to go. And so this is a philosophy of vision in that I think one of the biggest ways that it's going to be useful to people is that it will give you the framework to be able to develop a vision for your life, a like end point where you're aiming for, so that every decision you make in your life, you can be like, that's where I want to go. Is this decision taking me there? So it's a philosophy of vision. Growing up, my dad really drilled into me the importance of vision, and I'm so grateful that he did, because it has been one of the most important ideas that has driven me in my development of understanding of the world, which has led to this presentation even now. Decision making is extremely difficult without vision, and that's why I think a lot of us have a lot of ambiguity. It's like, oh, who should I get married to? What kind of job should I get? Questions like that become a lot more crystal clear if you know where you're trying to go, and you can ask, and you can have specific criteria about what do I want and what do I not want that's going to help or hinder my ability to get where I'm going. Vision gives purpose when you just like think about when you wake up in the morning and it's like, why am I living my life? Vision kind of gives you an idea of like, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing today, because it's taking me somewhere that I want to go. Vision versus mission. I kind of just alluded to this, but mission is how you're getting there. And you have to be willing to constantly change what the mission looks like in order to accomplish the vision. You can't be caught up on the process. You have to be willing to change the process and to constantly reevaluate the process to make sure it's going where you want. And a really easy, maybe personal way of connecting to this idea is, have you ever been in a situation with a group or at a job where somebody was just so stuck on just like having to follow a certain rule that was there, or following a certain tradition that's always been around, and they just like so strongly insist that we have to do it this way. But you, maybe being a newer person who just came in, are looking at it and you're like, but doing it that way isn't getting us where we're trying to go. It's maybe like really inefficient, or maybe it's taking things in the opposite direction of where you want them to go. And it's so frustrating when people want to just do it the way it's always been done, rather than reevaluating and being like, is the way we're doing it still taking us toward where we want to go? Or do we need to reevaluate? Do we need to come up with a new process that's going to be better at getting us where we want to go? So, with specific regards to philosophy is a vast field, and people have talked about who knows how many things in the history of philosophy, at least in Western civilization. And then if you include all the other civilizations, you can add even more to it. And they've talked about so many things. And like, for most of you who are listening to this, are you going to spend your whole life reading everything that every philosopher has ever talked or argued about? Like, you don't have that much time. So, with vision, we can start to ask the question of, what are the parts of philosophy that we actually want to know and spend our time contemplating and thinking about that are actually going to add value to our life and that are going to give us direction in life? And I think that a common assumption in philosophy that leads to a lot of this like endless arguing and talking about things that aren't necessarily always important or relevant is that philosophers tend to just assume that human beings want to know what's true. Therefore, anything that might be true or not true is worth talking about or arguing about. But I would argue that human beings have very specific things in life that they want, and that when it comes to philosophy, human beings are going to be much happier if they study the things in philosophy that actually tap into the things that they want, rather than just talking about anything and wasting tons of time talking about things that aren't necessarily helping them out. So, if this assumption that human beings want to know what is true, what do we want to know is true? And why do we want to know that it's true? Because again, there's an infinite number of things that could be talked about, an infinite number of things that could be learned or discussed. So what is it that we want to know? And why do we want to know it? So one of the primary premises of my philosophy is that it is irrational for human beings to engage in dialogue about whether something is or isn't true without first establishing that the subject of discussion is something they actually want to know. So, before you get into a discussion talking with somebody about whether something is or isn't true in any area of your life, if it starts turning into an argument, maybe pause for a second and ask yourself, is getting an answer to what it is that we're arguing about going to be a useful piece of information that's going to help us live our lives? Is it something that we need to know? Is it something that we actually want to know? So, vision gives purpose and direction to philosophy, and I'm hoping that this philosophy is filled with vision. So, this next part, the lifetime of a human, is a pretty simple idea, and, maybe some of you who have more supernatural beliefs might find this oversimplified, but I think from the perspective of a human being, this is the most that we can see, at least with our eyes, which is essentially that we are born into the world, we say things, we behave, we experience things, we feel things, we do things, and then one day we die. And if you were to describe the essence of being a human being, and from the outside looking in and being like, what does the life of a human being look like? This is what it looks like. You're born, you do things, and then one day you die. That maybe feels a little bit bleak, but the reason I'm bringing it up this way is specifically to draw attention to the fact that we are part of bigger something than ourselves. So, it's really easy to see your life just from your perspective. And so from just your perspective, seeing yourself in such a short little blip of time where one day you're born, you have like a really short amount of time to do a few things, and then you're going to die. And it's just like, what is the point of it all? But in reality, we're part of a human system. We're part of something bigger than just our individual lives. And the things that you do throughout your life, the things that you experience throughout your life, are a result of things that came before you. People made sacrifices, people learned things, people taught things, people were kind to each other. And, of course, some not so great things happened before you got here too. But before you got here, even the fact that you exist is because somebody had to put in work and effort into conceiving you and then giving birth to you and then raising you. And those are things completely outside of your control. So there are things that happened before you came along that happened so that you are now alive and living. And you're going to do things in your life, and then you're going to die one day. And after you die, people are going to come after you. And the things that you do and the things that you say and the way that you treat others is going to have an impact in that bigger picture of what comes after you. So we're a part of bigger something than ourselves. The lifetime of an individual human being is not all that matters. There's a little bit more going on than just your individual life, your individual feelings, your individual opinions. A different way of conceptualizing this idea, more in the philosophy academic sphere at least. This was an idea introduced to me my freshman year at college, and I absolutely loved it. I feel like it so beautifully and poetically paints this picture of what the whole academic university thing is about. So there's this philosopher named Kenneth Burke, and he wrote this, I don't know what you'd call it, passage, or I don't know what you'd call it. But he wrote this thing called The Unending Conversation. And the basic idea is that you walk into a room where a bunch of people are having a conversation. And they've already been having the conversation for a really long time. And in fact, the conversation started before half of them even got there. So nobody in the room even really actually knows where the conversation started. But you come in and you listen to their conversation, and you start to get an idea what they're talking about. So then you enter the conversation, and you give your ideas, and some of the people agree with you, and some of them disagree with you. And, everybody continues talking, and then at some point, you get up and you go to leave. And after you leave, people continue to have the conversation, and new people join the conversation. So it's just kind of this idea that, there's something bigger happening. There's this collective human effort to try to understand and know and learn things is kind of what's happening in academia. And as individual human beings, we come into the conversation after the conversation is long started. And then at some point we're going to leave the conversation. It's going to continue after we're gone. So the part that we play is something that we get to decide. But what we can't decide is the fact that we're just a small part and that something much bigger than us is happening. So we can either be frustrated by that. I don't find that frustrating. I find it extremely beautiful, and it makes me extremely excited to live my life and to be a part of this conversation. And I'm extremely grateful for coming so late in the conversation, as it were, because I'm so excited that there's so much that I get to learn that other people have already figured out. And it feels so much more creative to me to be able to figure out some of these much more advanced, complex things that people in history never had a chance of figuring out because they were so early on in the conversation. So, yeah, I think this is incredibly cool and exciting. So, that wraps up the big picture. So, within the big picture, we have wisdom is critical, but it's really hard to find. We have vision gives purpose and direction to philosophy. And we have the short life of a human, where your life as a human being is a little bit less about you, and it's more about the bigger picture and this bigger collection of humanity that we're a part of. So, getting into the next part, we're going to be talking about agents and agency. Something you've probably already noticed a little bit, but especially throughout the whole rest of the presentation. To some degree, take everything I say with a grain of salt. This whole presentation wasn't meant to be, like a academic masterpiece. It's really more of just this is the beginning for me. This is an idea I plan on refining for a very long time. And I'm lacking so many sources, and there's obviously so much I still have to learn. So Please forgive me for being a little bit loose around definitions. A lot of it I'm kind of just making up, again, kind of from my perspective and my best understanding of the world from the life that I've lived so far. So when I make claims and stuff, like, I'm not making these claims like I think that they absolutely have to be true. These are just my ideas and the best I understand, and I'm extremely excited, again, at the end of all of this, to hear what other people think about my ideas, and I'm sure a lot of the questions I get asked will force me at some point to become a lot more specific and precise with my definitions and ideas. So, with that said, this is my definition of an agent. And this is also based on my definitions of reality in the physical world that will come later, so some of the wording might sound kind of funny here at first, but... So, my definition of an agent is that an agent is an arrangement like a living organism within the universe which has been programmed to interact with the reality around it in a certain way. So essentially, the universe is made up of a bunch of things, and most of those things kind of follow the natural order, or they just kind of, do what they would normally do. Like, you throw a rock, and it just falls to the ground, and the rock didn't do it on purpose, the rock was just following gravity, where, in contrast, an agent is something that is, well, still technically following natural laws and everything. It's kind of this arrangement of things where you have something like an animal, where an animal can choose to defy gravity by jumping up, as opposed to just falling down as a rock would. Yes, an agent is pieces of reality have arranged themselves in a certain way where you now have kind of this subsystem that is behaving and intentionally doing things. So, in order for something to be an agent, to be able to interact with the universe in a certain way, then it has to have the capacity for perceiving and experiencing the world. Because if it can't perceive or experience any part of reality, then it would have no ability to intentionally do anything. It would, like the rock, just fall to the ground because it couldn't perceive that it was above the ground, or on the ground, or floating in the water. So, must have capacity for perceiving or experiencing the world. Power is a huge part of being an agent. If an agent doesn't have power, then it can't intentionally act to do anything. Power is the capacity of an agent to actually do something to correct or change the course of things happening the way they otherwise would. And so, as I've kind of been implying, an agent, in order for something to be considered an agent, it must have both motive and power to carry out its motive. So if you had something that had motive, but it didn't have any power, it wouldn't be an agent. And there are tons of things which have power, theoretically, but without the context of a motive, something that has power is really just an inanimate thing existing, in which case really doesn't actually have power. I guess you could say that energy is one form of power. So I guess you have something like the sun that is generating power, but it's not an agent because, again, it's just following the natural laws. Agents have to have motive and power. Now, like I just said, energy is a kind of power, but power also includes about hardware and software. I don't know how philosophers have ever referred to these things before, or if they have, or how the field of psychology refers to these things. I'm using the words hardware and software like a computer. It's kind of how I think about it a little bit. But outside of just outright energy, hardware is kind of having like the mechanical ability to do something. So on a camera, or even on a human being, you could say like the eyeball is a hardware. It's a physical mechanical thing that is doing something useful for the purpose of the human being. And then software is, of course, like our DNA. It's like the code that is kind of where the motive is going to be found in an agent. And then knowledge is a huge element of power for most agents, and I'm going to get a bit more into that later, but knowledge is a huge thing when it comes to power, because knowledge is about having an accurate understanding of how the world works, and having an accurate understanding of how something in the world works gives you huge predictive power to be able to anticipate how the world is going to be and to navigate around that to maximally make it the way that you want it to be. One of the fundamental things for me about agents, and of course this includes human beings, is that in order for them to ever begin behaving or acting, they must have an externally derived motive or desire. We can't give ourselves motive and then act according to that motive. We have to have an original motive or an original desire, which causes us to behave in the first place, and then everything that we do after that, even if we set up lesser motives and lesser desires, they're always going to be to accomplish that previous motive or desire. I think that simply by definition and conception of the idea of agency, motive must be externally derived. Otherwise, you have an infinite feedback loop that's impossible. So, fundamental idea for me about agency, there must be an externally derived motive, and once there is an externally derived motive, an agent cannot intentionally modify its primary or original motive, because it would have to have a higher motive for wanting to do it, so it can't go beyond the highest one. So yes, all behavior will be in strict alignment with the motive that was externally derived, and there will be no intentional deviations. Of course, being in the physical world where things go wrong all the time, there could definitely be unintentional deviations, but not intentional ones. And then, of course, as with human beings especially, but also with animals, motives can be many, and they can not necessarily be straightforward. So, it's not like there's just one simple motive that drives everything. There could be multiple priorities, and it's not always clear which one is the higher priority, and that can lead to very strange kind of behavior, and human beings have a lot of strange behavior, so that could kind of make sense. I said before, knowledge is power. So there are different kinds of knowledge that I'm going to refer to. Fully pre-programmed knowledge is the programs written into our DNA, written into the DNA and the makeup of living organisms that is there from the beginning, but seems to already know things about the world. So human beings don't like sour things or bitter things. We have a sensitivity of taste to sour and bitter because those indicate food that have gone bad, and they indicate poison. Because poison tends to be bitter, and bad food tends to be sour. So we didn't learn as a child that those tastes meant those things necessarily. We just if you put something sour in a baby's mouth, they try to spit it out. And it's because they've been programmed with a sensitivity to that. So that's fully pre-programmed, came written into the code. But it's a kind of knowledge because it reflects something that's true about reality, that eating something sour could kill the baby, and so it doesn't want to eat it. And it doesn't know why, it just doesn't. Then we have partially pre-programmed things, which are programs that are basically set up to learn about the world in its current specific circumstance. So, on the whole taste train of thought, we have the capacity to learn to like things that we don't immediately like. So maybe you were even thinking with sour things, it's possible to learn to like sour things, or with bitter things. I taught myself to like straight black coffee. So we kind of have this other code written in where once we become familiar with something and it didn't kill us, then suddenly now we can like it. So we have programs that have the capacity to change and adjust based on our experiences and aren't necessarily just hardwired. And then, of course, the most common kind of knowledge people are generally thinking is conscious knowledge. And this is the kind of knowledge we can recall with our consciousness. This knowledge is the knowledge we use words to describe. It's knowledge we can access directly with our conscious mind to try to use to make decisions or to strategize or to plan ahead about the world. Realistically, when an agent is obtaining knowledge, things are going to go wrong. So, like I said earlier, the hardware pieces, the software pieces, things can break, things can become corrupted, things can be encoded incorrectly. So even as a human being, as this is, of course, going to kind of wind down to eventually, even what we think that we know, we should always hold with a little bit of uncertainty because we don't have a perfect ability to obtain or retain information. Our memories are always kind of distorted, and even as we're live perceiving data, there are distortions and it's always a little bit off. So software can mess things up too. Even within our brains, when we hear something, our brain might tell us we heard something different than what we actually heard because of something we saw. It's really weird how that all works. So, to kind of sum up about agents, Agents have a few things. They have a primary motive, as indicated here by the heart. And then they have hardware for perceiving and experiencing the world. Some of that is external and some of that is internal. But nonetheless, there's hardware. And then there's pre-programmed software, which is kind of where the motive is going to come from originally, and a lot of other behaviors are going to come from. And then agents have learning and memory, which means they have the capacity, using their hardware, to perceive the world. And then the only real use that perception is going to be is if that perception is encoded and recorded and then used in the future. And of course, memory is not existent in all agents. Of course, that gets into like how picky you want to be about the definition of an agent. But theoretically, you can have an agent that has all pre-programmed software and it doesn't have any like changing programmed software. So everything that it learns, like it can't learn live, but it technically still knows stuff and is behaving according to that knowledge that it was given along with its motive when it came into existence. So to kind of paint a picture here at the end of the whole thing on agency, I kind of want to go through like a progression because this will kind of give a little bit more clarity of what I'm thinking with regards to agency. So this first picture is of a waterfall, is what I want attention drawn to. And in our imagination, a waterfall has no agency whatsoever. It is the natural world acting naturally. The water is falling because of the law of gravity. It's just happening the way that it has to happen because of what it is and the reality of the world. Now, the next step up, I think, toward agency, I have here is an analog clock. And this clock is running from a set of gears. I guess maybe this kind of clock technically would have a battery, which means there's maybe a little bit more programming. But let's assume you're talking about like a grandfather clock that has like the big weights. And the clock is keeping the time, but it's fully mechanical. Therefore, it's hardly different than the waterfall. It's in its existence and what it's doing, it is simply existing according to the natural laws of the world. But it's slightly different because human beings created it to do a purpose. So it's almost like an extension of the agency of human beings, but like it's barely an agent because it has hardware, it has the hands, and the hands are doing something, and they are representing a kind of knowledge. But it's only an agent in so much as it's doing something that human beings meant for it to do. In an absence of a human being, time on a clock would be meaningless. A next step up then would be a programmed electronic device where it has more advanced settings where all of the circuits and everything are still following the laws of physics and reality. But it has a bit more complexity to what it's doing. It's not just mechanically moving like the clock is, it's actually doing more advanced functions of maybe doing math and calculating and things like that are a little bit more advanced forms of agency. The next step up, this is where we start getting into life. And just for fun, since it's 2020, might as well use a picture of the coronavirus, right? Viruses are kind of on the edge of, in biology, what they consider to be life, where they're not sure that they consider it life because technically it's almost kind of like the clock, or even, kind of like the clock, because technically it's doing something and it's continuing to exist, so there seems to be some level of intentionality, but at the same time, it really seems to be more of just like a piece of dirt floating around, and it just happens to interact with living biological things in a certain way, and the living biological things do all the work. The virus doesn't really actually do any of the work. The virus just exists, and then it causes the living things to interact with it. So it's like borderline, like, is it really an agent? Is it really intentionally doing anything? But as you can kind of see in the picture, it has hardware. It has external hardware. It doesn't seem to have an internally programmed motive, so it wouldn't fit my definition of agent, but the next step up I'm using, maybe this is for biology people, a dramatic step up, but the next one I have is a plant, And with a plant, you have, at least as far as I can understand, there's definitely more of a sense of agency. It's trying to reproduce, and it grows and it changes and it does things very specifically and on purpose. So, I don't know. Maybe there's not a huge difference between plants and insects when it comes to agency, other than that something like a bee to a human being looks a lot more like an agent, in that it looks a lot more like us as agents. But I'd say even with plants and insects, we tend to think that they're just doing exactly what they have to because of the way that they've been specifically and intricately programmed, and they don't necessarily have capacity for much memory. But again, I don't know. I don't understand these things. Perhaps bees or maybe even plants actually have capacity for memory in a way that I don't know about. But at least within the human conception, I feel like we kind of see plants as being a bit more passive, insects as being a little bit more active, but then we see animals as being a lot more closer to like us as agents. They tend to have a bit more wherewithal and a more advanced ability to conceive and understand reality. And in that understanding and in that memory, they have an ability to act with intentions around the way that the world works. And then, of course, human beings. And we are the ultimate agents because we have consciousness, right? We have the capacity to know why we're doing things rather than just reacting to the world based on the way we're programmed. So, there's kind of a picture of the levels of agency as I can best understand them. Just key wrapping up points. Knowledge is always partial. And since knowledge is partial, as an independent human being, there's a very, very limited amount of the world that you can actually learn about. And it's actually not only because knowledge is partial, but it's also because as that human being who comes into the conversation really late and leaves really early, so much of that conversation happened outside of your ability to know and learn about the world. So when you come into that conversation, you kind of have to decide who you're going to trust and why you trust them. So as human beings, when it comes to knowledge and understanding, and when it comes to science, we can't be experts in all the fields. We can't know everything that we would need to know in order to make good judgments about what seems to be true in all of these fields. So as human beings, our knowledge and what we think that we know about the world, we know the most when we're engaged in a collective knowledge, where we're trusting other people who know a lot more about the world in specific areas that we haven't really looked into. But we trust them, and then we listen to what they have to say about that part of reality. And at the end of the day, a lot of it does come down to being kind of emotional and establishing a sense of who we think does and doesn't have our interest in mind. It's not always going to be about whether we think they give accurate information. We don't want to know whether they're giving accurate information. We want to know whether the information they're giving is information that's going to help them or that's going to help us. Because, again, since knowledge is infinite, going back to the whole vision thing, people will seek knowledge that's beneficial to them. So, because it's something that they needed for what they cared about. And so, my whole point in bringing this up is just, when it comes to science and when it comes to people talking about beliefs about different things in the world, one of the reasons why conversations get derailed a lot is because it's not always really about logic. A lot of it's going to come down to who can and can't be trusted, and are the people doing the research, do they have my interest in mind? And if they don't, why would I trust anything they have to say? Maybe rather than having conversations about logic all the time in philosophy, we could have conversations about, and this is more psychology, but who can we trust and why can we trust them? And what are reliable ways of determining what information is valuable and useful? Those are some subjects that I feel like could use a lot more attention than they generally get. And given attention specifically in light of understanding that some people don't trust, and emotionally addressing their distrust and not being annoyed at their distrust or dismissive of their distrust, but rather engaging them and taking seriously how they feel with some empathy. Okay, so that was kind of a really big one, but that's going to be kind of one of the really core ideas to everything, which is the whole idea about agents exist, specifically human beings are agents, and it fits in really nicely with the whole vision thing. But human beings come into the world already programmed with a set of desires and things that we want to do and accomplish in our lives. And understanding that about yourself is going to help you a ton. But we'll get more into that later. Next up, kind of a step back, but another fundamental piece to everything. This is just kind of my foundation of basic knowledge and epistemology, I guess. But everything, when we talk about what's true and what's not true, what we're having a conversation about is what exists and what doesn't exist. And specifically in the context of a conversation, when we say that something does exist, like we mean 100% absolutely that thing does exist. There's not any like, it exists sometimes, or it exists for me but it doesn't exist for you. It's like, no, when something exists, it exists 100%. And of course, there are things that are like true for you that aren't true for me. So like 100% of the time is always exactly what we just said. Like, it's kind of a weird thing to say because most things aren't 100% always the way that they are. But the whole idea of like things existing and things not existing is that there are things that don't change and things that do change, and the things that do change always change the same way. There are things that are the same and things that are different, and the things that are different and they're not the same. And it's just like, there are about a million ways to put it, and I listed some of them here with like 0, 1, on, off, yes, no. But like, the very, very fundamental of any conversation is always going to come back to the assumption that truth is absolutely, completely true. That like, we're investigating something that is stable and constant, and that when we find something, that it is the same for everybody, that this thing is the way that it is. There are people who say they don't believe in absolute truth, but I don't think that that's what they mean. I think pretty much everybody should agree that when we talk about truth, we're talking about that which is constant and unchanging. So there shouldn't be a dispute about absolute truth. Absolute truth is the like essence and foundation of science, as well as the essence and foundation of having a conversation with anybody ever about anything, because all the words that you're using rely on the assumption that the words still mean today what they did yesterday. Anyway. So truth is absolute, and truth refers to what does exist, and what does exist definitely exists. It is not it kind of exists. Like it exists or it doesn't exist. At least in its most fundamental form. The word universe comes up a few times throughout the presentation, and when I say universe, I mean everything that exists. I don't mean everything that we know about, or just the physical world. Things might exist beyond the physical world, and if they do, then they exist, by definition. When we say exist, when we say everything that exists, we mean everything that exists. Or at least that's what I mean. So, if there's like the philosophy whole hypothesized simulation where our world isn't actually real, because it's a simulation, kind of like we have video games and movies. I don't think that makes any sense. So like, it makes a ton of sense. But the idea that our reality isn't actually real, that statement, I don't think makes any sense whatsoever. Our reality is exactly what it is, and the way that we think about it in our head has absolutely no bearing on the fact that it does or doesn't exist. And when we look at the world and when we see things, what we're seeing is what's actually there. So, if we were actually living in a simulation, then the simulation is exactly what it is that we're seeing and experiencing. This might seem like a little redundant, but like, I just think that the idea of God, or the supernatural, or Plato's whole allegory of the cave, and other things existing that are more complex and like levels above what we see and experience, I 100% absolutely think those things could exist, and it's very possible. So when I say universe, when we talk about things that exist, we're not just talking about the physical world, we're talking about literally everything that exists. The only thing is, we probably can't actually know those other things. So we can know that they might exist, but we can't know that they do exist. So, one of the fundamentals of my philosophy in the physical world is that there are things that do exist and things that don't exist. And anytime we talk about what's true or not true, that's exactly what we're asking. What does exist and what doesn't exist. And then the last piece, this is a pretty simple piece, but when it comes to the things that exist and the things that don't exist, part of what holds them constant is that there seems to be some kind of governing set of rules and boundaries that the physical world has to live by. And this is earlier when I was talking about agency. When you throw a rock, when the natural world exists, it just does what it does. And the reason it does what it does, the way that it exists, the way that it continues on its paths and ways of being, is that there's some kind of like invisible law and rule that's holding things together. And I call that the fabric of reality. So without something like the fabric of reality, things couldn't exist. You need the fabric of reality to kind of hold everything together. Things exist because the fabric is holding them together. If there wasn't something governing or holding things, there would be no way to have knowledge, because nothing would be constant enough to be able to quantify or map as consistent. And just as a funny example, when I'm thinking about all of these like bigger existential questions, I often think of Minecraft, because it's a very, like, within the game of Minecraft, you encounter like the coding aspect of it a lot, because you're like typing commands and stuff. A lot of video games, you don't actually interact with the coding where you're actually playing the game. But since you can like actually change the rules of the game and stuff like that as the player, you kind of have like more intimate feeling of the fact that the rules of the game are being governed by a set of programmed rules, and you can go in and change the program, and when you change the programmed rules, then the like fabric of reality, as it were, for Minecraft actually changes. Like, it will affect whether you can just fly off into space or whether gravity actually works on you. And so, again, with that in mind, there's kind of this like, if you were in the game of Minecraft as a character and not as the human being on the outside, like if you were a sheep or a zombie, even if they were somehow like sentient in their own world, there would be no way for them to conceptualize our laws of physics. Because the program is set up for them to understand their programmed world. They can't like think outside of that. So even if we were technically living in a simulation and there was some like other existence that our existence was a part of, it could completely exist, but like we can't know about it really. I guess there's a way we could be notified that that one idea is true, because we can conceive that idea, but we wouldn't be able to actually like know what it was like, because our brains don't have the hardware, the software to conceive anything outside of this physical world that we're existing in, that we can see and perceive. So, fabric of reality, that's just like the foundation, the rules that govern everything in life. This is where it starts to get a little bit more practical. Those last few points maybe seemed a little bit impractical, but we're going to get a little bit more practical now. So, going back to the whole vision thing, what do humans want? This is a question that is probably a very hotly debated thing for a lot of people and a lot of groups. I'm going to start by answering the question, referring to a book written by Martin Seligman, or Seligman. I'm not sure how to say his name. I'm going to say Seligman. He wrote this book called Flourish. I think it came out in 2013. But he is a psychologist in the field of positive psychology, which is a fairly new developing branch of psychology, which kind of focuses on human flourishing and well-being, which is why he called the book Flourish. And within his book, he kind of describes that human well-being and flourishing rests on what humans do for their own sake. Like, not their as in human's sake, but what do humans do, where the thing that they're doing, they're just doing because they wanted to do that thing. So, something like within philosophy, there was that assumption I brought up earlier, right? Where like human beings seem to just like want to know what's true about the world. In some sense, you could say that human beings like to pursue and understand knowledge simply for the sake of having knowledge, without any other greater motive or reason why. And his idea, I think, perfectly aligns with my idea that agents always have a reason for what they do, and that there's like an inborn motive that they have. And so his idea is that there are inborn motives that humans have, and there are specifically a select few of them, that when we achieve them, as it were, or when they become like a part of our life, that we have these things, that tends to be when human beings are like the happiest and most fulfilled and glad that they're alive and they seem to be flourishing. Within the idea that human beings are creatures which have pre-programmed desires, I think a lot of times the word happy we tend to attribute to being somewhat hedonistic, or maybe, as he even mentions in the book, we think of happy as just being like a mood, where it's like how we feel just like for a short period of time, or that we can even like pretend to be happy. But when I think about the concept of happy and unhappy, and what I'm really going to be getting into here, and what Martin Seligman is really trying to get at with his book Flourish, is that as human beings, our lives are lived emotionally. And when we use words, when we describe reality, there are a lot of things we talk about that are like logical, but at the end of the day, what we care most about is how we feel. And our feelings are the internal calibration we have as a sensitivity to what it is that we're programmed to want. So when we do things that are bad for us, we tend to have bad feelings. And when we do things that are good for us, we tend to have good feelings. And so the word good and the word bad isn't necessarily moral. They're just feelings words. They're not logical. There's no logical way to say that something is good or bad, except for in relationship to whether it's accomplishing the said purpose or not. And with human beings, we have desires or purposes we're trying to fulfill. And so good and bad are these emotional words that directly correlate to our emotional experience. So good and bad, I'm not referring to them as... With that said, there's a picture of the book. So according to Seligman, here are the 5 core elements of things that happy, flourishing human beings have in their life. And these are 5 things that human beings tend to pursue for no other reason than to have the thing itself. So one of them, this is the most obvious probably to all of us, which is positive emotion. Things that bring us positive emotion are things that we actively pursue constantly and all the time. The next one is engagement. Engagement is this idea that you're like really, really into something. If you're familiar with the concept of flow, it's like this thing where you're just like enraptured in it. You're caught up in it. You become one with the thing. And he describes in the book also that people tend to describe time stopping. And it's like, that happens in movies a lot too, right? Like, we just watched The Greatest Showman the other day, and it's like, there were a few times in the movie when like there's the applause, but then like everything's completely silent. And there's almost, to me, like the sense of flow in that moment where it's just kind of like the peak of their performance, and it's the peak of like the achievement. So engagement has to do with being like a part, like actively engaged in doing something and just being like caught up in it in a very positive way. Meaning, this is not necessarily surprising, but meaning is something that human beings desperately want. And meaning involves contributing to the greater good of others besides just one's own life and positive emotions. So people who just spend their whole life pursuing positive emotion, but don't pay any attention whatsoever to finding meaning in their life, where they're doing things that are helpful to others besides themselves, they tend to actually not be very happy people, and they don't like their lives, and they don't like themselves, and they don't feel proud of who they are. So human beings who are flourishing and who are happy are human beings who are contributing to the greater world and not just concerned about their own well-being. Achievement, this one is a little bit like engagement, and engagement and achievement are going to have a lot of overlap, but achievement has to do with just like mastering something, becoming really good at something. Human beings constantly try to master things for no other reason than to have mastered them. I still want to climb all the Colorado 14ers for no other reason than I would just love to be able to say that I climbed all of them, right? And it's like, even if I was the only person left on the planet, I would love to still go climb all of them just so I knew that I climbed all of them. There's just something about us as human beings where we want to just accomplish things. There are some of us, I think I'm somebody who's a little bit more accomplishment oriented, but at some level, all of us want to have some kind of accomplishment around something. And then one of the most important ones, and he kind of elaborates on this one a little bit in the book, which is relationships. And it's interesting because when we engage in relationships, we tend to find all of the other things. So then it's like, are we engaging in relationships simply for the sake of relationships? Or are we engaging in them because they give us positive emotion? Or because they add meaning to our life? But at the end of the day, even though you can't really separate relationships from the other four, there still seems to be something where we just, no matter what, we always pursue relationships just to have them. Like, we don't want to not have relationships. And we hate being lonely. So relationships are something we definitely really value. So these 5 elements, the forefront of positive psychology is kind of putting these out as like, these are the things that create really happy, flourishing human beings who love their lives. And the more humans have all of these things, the happier and more satisfied they tend to be. So just having a lot of one of them is never enough. You need to have a lot of all of them. Even if you just had a lot of 4 of them, if any of these is missing, it tends to really hinder or undercut somebody having a lot of satisfaction and happiness in their life. My own personal note, this isn't out of the book, although maybe he gets to this. I didn't actually read the whole book yet. But on top of those 5 things that lead to like happiness and flourishing, we obviously know that as human beings, we have that fundamental programming to stay alive and to maintain our physical existence. So we eat and we sleep and we reproduce and we avoid danger to protect our physical body from external threats and even internal threats. And I put that because if you don't eat healthy, you can get sick and have diseases, and that tends to be something we also want to avoid. So we have a programming to want to not be in that situation. We want to protect ourselves from cancer and from diseases. So that's another major piece on the table. What do humans want? And that one is really complicated, and it's going to be covered a bit more, definitely. But just starting out, I'm putting on the table that what humans want, our fundamental programming that drives all of our behavior, is we have the core obvious things like staying alive, eating, sleeping, reproducing. But then after that, the main thing, especially that our conscious mind is concerned about trying to figure out to get us, is those other 5 things that Martin Seligman brings up. We're looking for relationships, we're looking for meaning, we're looking for engagement and achievement and positive emotion. And a lot of those overlap, but at the end of the day, those are the things that when we get them, we feel fulfilled, we feel like we got what we were looking for, and when we don't have those things, we feel empty and we feel like we didn't get what we were looking for. So, in the bigger picture, if you bring it back to vision, I feel like for a human being to sit down and start constructing what are the decisions I'm going to make in my life, you're going to do a lot of benefits to yourself if you can look at those 5 elements and think about how you can strategically integrate those things into your life and understand that you need all 5 of them in order to be a flourishing, happy human being who loves their life. The next part I want to talk about, I'm calling it 2 minds. And again, take all of this with a grain of salt because this is extremely non-technical and I'm very underqualified to talk about this specifically. But this is more me talking about my personal subjective experience, paired with a little bit of vague understanding I have in psychology. So at some point in the future, hopefully, I'll be much more technical with this. But for the time being, I'm just calling it 2 minds. And I generally conceive that as myself, I have my conscious mind and my unconscious mind. And my unconscious mind is the source of all of my feelings and emotions. And that's where my desires come from. That's where, like, what I want. Like, if I feel happy or fulfilled with my life, that's something happening unconsciously. I can't consciously decide to feel a certain way. My feelings happen on their own, and I use my conscious mind to do things externally that I know will end up causing me to feel the way that I want to feel. The unconscious mind is, keeping you breathing. It's pumping your heart. It's managing your immune system. Like, there's a part of your brain managing all of these things that we obviously don't consciously participate in, but that are happening to, maintain our health. One of the interesting parts of our unconscious mind is that it processes information and prioritizes it. So when you go to bed, your brain makes a bunch of decisions about what things from the day to remember and which things to forget, based on how important it thinks those are to your survival. When you have to make really split-second decisions, like when you meet a new person, before you are even consciously aware of the fact that a human being is in front of you, your brain has already made a judgment about whether this person can be trusted or not. And this is where a lot of racism, things like that, end up coming from. We kind of have these like automatic, pre-programmed dispositions to be distrustful of people who don't look like us or sound like us or that we haven't seen a lot before. So unconsciously, we have a lot of programming that causes us to make all sorts of behaviors and decisions, and we don't even realize it half the time. But we're doing it not because we consciously thought it all the way out, but because our brain, understanding that the world is really complicated, has this programming to make quicker decisions by making a lot of assumptions and jumping to conclusions quickly. And in psychology, we call a lot of those heuristics. And then, of course, we have the conscious mind. And the conscious mind has the task of thinking ahead, strategizing, seeing past the obvious things, and being able to make complex, calculated evaluations of the world. And this is useful to us because by being critical thinkers, we're much better at being able to fulfill the needs and wants of our emotional mind, which is generally concerned with our well-being. This is an idea I've been thinking about a lot recently because I've been watching videos on free will and kind of the arguments for and against it. And I think that experientially, the reason we feel like we have free will is because there's that interaction between our conscious mind and our unconscious mind. In our conscious mind, we're thinking and calculating and making decisions about things. And it makes us feel like we're doing that completely free and of our own deciding. But the thing is, even like the word will implies motive. So it's like, I think the most realistic understanding of actually how free will works for us is that we have a will, which was pre-programmed that we did not decide, and we have the power to act to try to accomplish that will. And not only do we have the power, but we don't have the power to not try to accomplish that will. Literally all we can do is learn as much as we can about the world to best accomplish our will, as it were. And we don't really have a say in the matter, as far as I can tell. But in the creative process of making decisions to try to accomplish what we want and accomplish our will, we feel like we're free acting agents. And I guess in a sense, I kind of implied we are to a degree. The thing is, though, that a lot of our decisions don't actually happen because of our conscious mind. The unconscious mind kind of has a mind of its own and tends to make a lot of decisions for us. And since our unconscious mind doesn't have language, it just has programming to do certain things, we can't consciously think about what's happening because it's just happening. And there's no like tangible way for us to quantify that it's doing what it is. It can't talk to us. It can't be like, this is what I'm doing now. It just does what it's doing based on feelings. So in that sense, we don't entirely have free will because we can know something is bad for us, but if our unconscious mind has been programmed to respond in a way that is bad for us, then we know what we're doing is bad and yet we do it anyway. And that creates a lot of dissonance for us as human beings. But in that sense, I would say we don't entirely have free will. We don't entirely have the freedom to act according to what we consciously know is best for us, because sometimes our unconscious kind of takes over and has a mind of its own and does things even when we consciously know we shouldn't do them. And part of that is because a lot of the unconscious programming came long before we ever had conscious minds. That gets into evolution and stuff, but yeah, the unconscious mind cannot think ahead. It doesn't have language, and that causes a lot of problems and frustration for our thinking mind, which knows a lot, but doesn't always have control or power over our behavior. Within free will, you are always using your conscious mind to try to meet your emotional needs. There's no way for you to do otherwise. So, yep, that's just a fact. At least it is for me. Maybe it's not for you. You know how you feel. I know that for me, so far as I can tell, and as far as my philosophy goes, that's true. I think it's incredibly important to note that we have many ideas of what we think will make us feel good, and we call these ideas or things wants. This is kind of going the other way of what I was just saying, where sometimes our unconscious mind thinks that we want something, but consciously we know that it's actually bad for us. going the other way, there's actually a lot of times when our unconscious mind actually knows what's good for us, but in our conscious mind, we get really hung up on some of these ideas that we think are going to give us what we want, and then we chase after them, and they aren't actually what we want. But I'm going to make a distinguishment here between two ways of using the word want. So you could say, I want a girlfriend, but in reality, you don't necessarily actually want a girlfriend for the sake of having a girlfriend. What you want is relationship and positive emotion, which are two of those things that human beings seek for their own sake. So like there are other relationships that you could perceive or that you could pursue. You could just try to have a friend. You could go invest in a relationship with one of your family members, and that would be a relationship, and it would give you positive emotion. But when we think about having a romantic partner, it's this like, we romanticize it and we think about all the positive emotions that we're going to have and the certain kind of relationship it's going to be. And so what we're looking for is those positive emotions. We're not necessarily looking for a girlfriend for a girlfriend's sake. In that same way, when people say they want money, not a whole lot of people care about the paper. What people want is they want the power to do things that will make them feel good and the power to not feel bad. So when you can like barely pay the bills, that causes a lot of stress. And so money is a pathway out of that stress. Or if you think you really want to travel and that would be really exciting, or you want to go to amusement parks, or you just want to spend money on things that are fun. Like you want the power to be able to do those. And so you want the money so you can do those things that will make you feel a certain way. It's not the money itself that you want. And maybe less hedonistic, I want to go to college, is not that you want to go to college because college itself is just like a thing that you want. You want to go to college for reasons. You want to learn things. You want to be engaged in academia and becoming a part of that conversation I was referring to earlier. And you want power. Not in a bad way, but like in a good way, where like having learned things in college gives you the power to get a better job, which gives you more money, which gives you power over your life more. So we say that we want things, but a lot of times the things that we think that we want are actually a pathway to getting what we want. And so we should be really careful and analytical about those pathways. And in that whole vision mission thing, make sure that we're not getting so caught up in a process we thought would work that we're kind of missing what's actually going to work to get us where we actually want to go. Wisdom is where, like, this is one of the places where wisdom is going to play a part, where wisdom can help us distinguish between what we actually want and what we think we want. And this is where I think that in the Bible, there is a lot of wisdom about these things, where some of the passages in the Bible clearly articulate that difference between things that people think that they want, but that actually lead to destruction. And then there are things that we should want, like wisdom, which lead to life. Just kind of a meta thing that wisdom would say, seek wisdom. One of the reasons that knowledge is power is because we can use knowledge to recalibrate and reprogram even some of our unconscious habits and emotions that inaccurately reflect the world. So sometimes we're traumatized. We have a relationship that ended really poorly, and it makes us really hesitant to starting any new relationships. But that could be bad because we need relationships to be happy human beings. So we need to be able to use our conscious mind to be like, that relationship that ended bad involved maybe somebody who wasn't trustworthy. So we need to find someone who is trustworthy, and then we need to trust them. And that's going to be hard because unconsciously we learned to not trust anybody. But we can use knowledge to reprogram ourselves, and it's going to be hard, and we have to fight a lot of feelings. But that knowledge that we have in our conscious mind is going to be really powerful to be able to get around those unconscious, learned patterns and establish new patterns that eventually lead to a longer-term fulfillment and happiness. So, we need true, accurate information to plan ahead. This is why we care about seeking knowledge. This is why we care about philosophy. The unconscious brain is not concerned about the truth. The unconscious brain is just concerned about feeling good and keeping you alive. And it, for the most part, thinks it already knows how to do that. And our conscious mind is just kind of along for the ride to try to tell it when it's wrong and correct it, as hard as it is. There's this relationship between the conscious brain and the unconscious brain that's kind of mediating what's knowledge, what's true, and how does that correlate to our feelings and what we're trying to accomplish and what's going to make us feel good. And this almost feels kind of random, but this is where I decided to put this into the larger scheme of things. Since the unconscious part of our brain that is completely feelings-based is what's managing a lot of what's actually happening inside of us, the conscious part of our brain that's seeking to understand the world is doing it with the intention of keeping us safe. So if we feel unsafe, then our conscious logical brain just kind of shuts off anyway. Because if we're not safe, that's an immediate problem, that's not a long-term problem. And the conscious brain is concerned with long-term problems, the unconscious brain is concerned with the immediate and the right now. So if you're having a conversation with someone, and they feel unsafe, and they feel attacked, and they don't feel like you have their interest in mind, then they're not going to change their mind about anything, most of the time. It's incredibly difficult to change anybody's mind if they feel unsafe. Because when someone's feeling unsafe, they're not using their conscious brain, they're using their unconscious brain. When they're using their unconscious brain, they're rejecting everything that you say for no other reason than that they don't trust you. It has nothing to do with whether what you say makes sense or not, or whether what they believe makes sense or not. So, the next major thing that I just finished covering was about how we kind of have this duality in our mind between conscious and unconscious processes. It's way more complicated than I made it sound, and I don't even know the half of it, but when I think about myself and my behavior, it's kind of a rough formula or a rough framework that I use to kind of conceptualize the reason I have an urge to do something even when I logically know that I shouldn't, and I'm constantly going through a process of intentionally trying to recalibrate my emotions to accurately reflect what's going on in the world. So, what do human beings want to know? We talked a little bit about what humans want in the general sense, and it would seem that a lot of what we want involves having knowledge, but when it comes to philosophy, with this vision, what is it that we want to know? What do we want to talk about? I established then, already, earlier, that we seek knowledge for power, which is we seek knowledge to aid in accomplishing our core desires of being alive. And then we also seek knowledge for well-being, in that knowledge is a part of engagement and positive emotion, meaning, achievement, and relationships. And it applies to all of those to me very strongly, because when I'm seeking learning about things, I kind of enter this engagement, this sense of flow. I love learning, and I lose myself in that, and time stops. And it brings me a lot of positive emotion to learn new things, even if it's somewhat useless information. Just learning new things is intriguing to me. I love learning about spiders. It's really weird and random. Maybe insects in general, but it just makes me happy. So I pursue it for positive emotion. And then I don't entirely know about meaning off the top of my head, but there's a way in which they'd all apply. Especially relationships, I would say, is a big one, because we can learn about psychology because we want better relationships, not because we're just learning the information for fun. Although for me, it's both. And with achievement, it's you get a PhD, it's achievement, but it's achievement around knowledge. So, I kind of want to distinguish that there's two kind of tones or attitudes or postures you're going to take when it comes to seeking knowledge. So, if we're trying to seek knowledge for power, that is, if we're trying to seek knowledge specifically in the context of how is this going to be useful or profitable for accomplishing our specific needs and desires, then that's the question we're going to be asking. Is the question is seeking this knowledge, is spending the time to contemplate and understand this, is it going to keep me alive and keep me safe and keep me feeling good? Because if that knowledge isn't going to do those things, then you shouldn't be engaging it with that intent. And then, on the other side though, this is a huge one, of course, especially for someone like me, there is definitely a time and a place to seek knowledge for engagement and for positive emotion. But even in that context, there kind of has to be a vision behind it where it's like, you don't want to just endlessly and aimlessly do it. You want to do it with some degree of vision and being like balancing it with the other parts of your life and stuff. But I guess the tone difference that I wanted to bring here is it's like, when it comes to seeking knowledge for power, there's kind of this urgency to like needing to have an answer. And that's when arguments a lot of times happen, is when people are like, we need to have a right answer to this. We don't need to have a right answer unless the answer is actually critical to our well-being and like health. So if it's not, and we're seeking it for the purpose of engagement and achievement, and it's just like, those more complex reasons, then like, it's not about getting the answer, it's just about the process. In which case, there's absolutely no reason to have an argument or a heated debate about it, because it's about the curiosity, it's about the wonder, it's not about the getting an answer part. I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but within the whole like fabric of reality and things that exist and don't exist, and the whole thing about agents having hardware, I very strongly feel that even as human beings, our hardware and our software is limited to our physical world. And so seeking to know beyond that is just looking for frustration. We ask questions of like, is God real? And the place where I'm at in my life is I'm like, I think it's very possible that he is real. But for me, that falls in the category of the wondering, and not so much in the category of like essential and I need this for my well-being. I feel like for a human being to maximize what they were created for, what they were programmed for, there's nothing supernatural that needs to be involved. And I think that's pretty clearly obvious with a lot of the modern psychology research on positive psychology, where human beings who have those 5 things seem to be like extremely fulfilled and happy. And like, as I kind of have here in the PowerPoint, things like religion as like a framework for providing people an avenue for contributing to things that are bigger than themselves. Yeah, it can provide meaning, but what human beings are looking for is meaning. So like when other human beings who aren't Christian or who aren't Muslim or who aren't necessarily even in any religion, there are ways of them going and finding meaning in a way where they feel like their life matters and they feel like they're connected to something bigger than just their individual life. And that brings fulfillment just as much as somebody being a part of a religion that is organized and providing you a means to being connected to something. And so I think for me strongly that indicates that there's not one specific way of finding meaning that is the right way or the true way, but rather what's right or true is that human beings need and want meaning. They need to be connected to the bigger humanity and caring about the needs of others and not just their own. Something like religion can be a framework for that, but it's the framework that's helpful, not the specific beliefs within the religion. In which case, I strongly feel that maybe we should kind of get away from some of those beliefs, especially, I think, some of them that have a lot of toxic effects. But that's gonna, again, this whole philosophy is what's been going on in my mind, and this is a part of where my journey away from Christianity happened, where, especially within my own life, I didn't particularly feel like I actually needed what I kept telling myself that I needed. I kept telling myself I needed a relationship with God. But I didn't feel like I was actually being honest with myself, because I found other ways of finding meaning that seemed to work better than what I was experiencing as a Christian. So, all that to say, within the greater vision of philosophy, I think that if you're going to try to make the argument that the question of God is an essential existential well-being question, as opposed to falling in the category of just curiosity, you would need to be able to make a valid argument that relationship with God or spirituality in the way that you believe about spirituality somehow is one of the essential things that all human beings need. And if the research doesn't show that all human beings need that thing, or all human beings aren't programmed for that thing that you think that they are, then I don't think there's a valid way of justifying that it's something that human beings need to care about. But those are my ideas. I'm excited to hear what some of the reflections and other thoughts people have in response to that are going to be. What do human wants to know is the category I just finished talking about. Next category, should and shouldn't. Yay, more religious borderline kind of things. So, of course, one of the big things that people are going to talk about with religion not only is the whole meeting part, but they're going to be talking about morality. And are people going to, act morally if they don't have something like religion that's providing the truth about how people should and shouldn't live? And we have our conscience, right? That's a guiding principle for what we should and shouldn't do that we're all born with. Well, kind of. So, my understanding of morality is that it's a manifestation of our conscious and unconscious program for maintaining our own well-being and the well-being of other people. And all of those things that were listed in Martin Seligman's foundation of well-being and happiness for human beings, those are the things that we're programmed to want above all else. And so it would make a lot of sense that if we're programmed to want those above all else, that we would also be programmed with certain kind of inclinations toward behaviors that help make those things happen, and that we would also be programmed to have aversions to things that are counterproductive or anti those things happening. And yeah, I think morality can very easily be understood in that way. So one of the reasons, so it's interesting that I put empathy right here. But so when it comes to morality, I think one of the big things people misunderstand is they think that human beings are selfish. And I think that as human beings, we have an extreme sensitivity to selfish because we're not selfish. And we don't like selfish people. And we don't like when we're selfish. And a part of that is that we're empathetic. And so a lot of times people will talk about, is altruism legitimate? Do people actually self-sacrifice, or are they just doing some delicate manipulation where they do something good for somebody else because it makes them personally feel good, and that's the only reason they're doing it, or because they're going to have some long-term benefit of that person coming back and helping them one day. And I think that fundamentally misunderstands how empathy works in the human brain. So and empathy to me is incredibly important, and it's empathy is my highest value. Nothing motivates me in my behavior more than empathy. And the way that empathy works for me is that it's just I can't live with myself if I'm not being empathetic. And so you could say that, yeah, of course, I have an internal program to feel bad when I'm not empathetic and to feel good when I am empathetic. But we do have individualistic tendencies, and they kind of play out in weird ways. And so, anyway, with empathy, it's we act on empathy for its own sake. And an example that I actually thought of tonight when I was out is that I think this is an excellent example where it demonstrates empathy really, really well. So, as I said, some people might think that, okay, so you're nice to other people because you want them to be nice back to you. You've had a feeling before, and you didn't like having it. And so you don't want anybody else to have that feeling either. That's a very, not individualistic, selfish way of being. Where, a selfish, individualistic human being would be I didn't like having that feeling, and I will do anything to never have that feeling again. Empathy is, I would be willing to have that feeling again if it meant somebody else didn't have to have that feeling. We're willing to put ourselves through suffering because we don't want other people to suffer. It's something we willingly choose to do. And it's just because we're programmed that way. And tonight what happened was I was out at a restaurant picking something up. And to me, it's ever since I worked at a restaurant, so I worked at the ice cream shop for a while, and customers would come in and they'd be so rude sometimes. And they would, I'm sure everybody knows what that's like, right? They're impatient. They wanted it exactly a certain way. They wanted it perfect. They wanted it done right the first time. And sometimes, as the server, your lack of ability to do that has nothing to do with you. So like, sometimes I couldn't give customers what they wanted, and that was outside of my control. I wasn't the one in charge of making sure that the product was ready to go, or, maybe something went wrong that was outside of kind of all of our controls at the shop. But people come in and they get mad about it. And nothing was more incredibly frustrating than being in the ice cream shop and somebody coming in and being mad that they couldn't have something and I couldn't do anything about it. I hated that feeling. So now, anytime I go to a restaurant ever, like, I am the most patient person ever. Like, when I order something, it could take them an hour and they would come out and they'd be like, "Oh man, I'm so sorry it took so long." And I would just give them a huge smile and be like, "It's okay." And my motivation to do that isn't because I have any vested interest in getting any kind of... I never plan on working in food service again, ever. Not a huge fan of it, and also just kind of doesn't fit my personality at all. But it's like, I'm never going to get anything personally from treating other people that way. Especially like if I drive through random towns and stuff that I'm never going to be back to. But like, I have a sense of empathy. Like, I don't want people to feel the way that I felt when customers came in and were a jerk to me and I couldn't do anything about it. Like, I hated that. And I don't want anyone else to ever have to feel that. And so I go way out of my way anytime I go to a restaurant to be super considerate and to just be kind and patient. And when the server comes out and they do what they're doing, and to just be like, "Hey, like, I appreciate what you did, and I am going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you're doing the absolute best that you can to do a good job." And yeah, it's empathy. Like, I'm not getting anything from that, but it's just like, I don't want anyone to ever have to feel that way that I felt. So it's a very non-selfish thing, and it's because as human beings, we care a lot about each other. It's not just about us individually. So when it comes to moral and ethics, I think a lot of ideas are off, because a lot of moral ideas kind of focus on this idea that human beings naturally want to be selfish and be self-serving, but I don't think that we do, and we don't tend to be happy or fulfilled when we're selfish. I guess I have a few more examples on here. I like to teach people things. That brings me positive emotion, I guess, but there are some things that actually don't. Teaching people stick shift is very scary, actually, a lot of times, especially when you're doing it in your own vehicle that they're damaging potentially, as they're being very jerky and not handling everything properly because they're just learning how to do it. It's not a pleasant experience for me to teach people how to drive a stick shift in the actual moment of doing it, but I love the feeling of mastering things that I thought were outside of my ability. And both stick shift and Rubik's Cube fell in that category, where there was a point in my life I was convinced I'm not the kind of person who could do these things. But then somebody had the patience to teach me how to do these things. And I was so proud and I felt so good about myself once I mastered them. And so I kind of have this internal motivation to want to teach people Rubik's Cube and to teach people how to drive a stick shift, because I want other people to also have that feeling of accomplishment and being proud at doing something that they, going into it, were so convinced that they couldn't actually do. I love teaching people Rubik's Cube, especially for that, where it's like, they're like, "Oh, that's a thing that smart people do." And then they learn how to do it, and then they're like, "Man, I'm a smart person." I'm like, I love that you feel smart about yourself. Makes me happy. So, humans are individualistic and collective. They are not just one. They are not just collective, which is also partly why socialism is not necessarily a great idea. But we are individualistic and collective, and there's this funny kind of dance and balance that has to be found between the two. In the book Flourish by Seligman, he actually mentions how in the insect world, ants and bees and these colony group-based organisms tend to dominate the insect world. And going back kind of to the fabric of reality, there are certain laws of the world that actually play out in the natural world in this way, where even among things that we consider to be agents, they still have to follow the fabric of reality to a degree, or almost entirely, as it were. But one of these rules of the world that seems to be true is that agents that cooperate with each other tend to be a lot more successful than ones that try to just strike out on their own and are very individualistic. So in the insect world, that seems to be true, that the most dominant, flourishing insects are the ones that work together as a team, and they are much more successful than the other insects. And so in that same way, it would make sense that human beings have risen to the top of the mammal and bigger animal kingdom, largely because we became programmed to work together as a team and to look out for one another rather than just looking out for ourselves. So, one other thing, like, sometimes we do things out of empathy because we're concerned about the feelings of others, but we do have another group programming which is not so directly positive, which is that we have an innate sensitivity to not alienating ourselves from the group, because when we're alone, it's dangerous for us. We're safe with the group, and we're very unsafe without the group. And that was especially true for most of human history before civilization. So this causes a lot of really awkward, weird behaviors where, like, we'll do things that we, on one side of our mind, think are wrong, or that are not in our best interest, or that are extremely painful and uncomfortable, but we'll go to great lengths to not alienate ourselves from the bigger group. Whether it's putting up with all sorts of, like, horrible moral things happening. Like, we'll try to justify them, we'll try to ignore them, but a lot of times we don't like to upset the group. We don't want to stand out too much, because if we become alienated, that can be really dangerous for us. So, with that said, when it comes to feelings of guilt and shame and responsibility, that, like, we have a responsibility to other people, I think a lot of those emotions come from the fact that we have an innate sense to not alienate ourselves from the group. And so when we do things that hurt other people in the group, and when we do things that are not good for the group, it's important that we feel bad about it, because that's how we get back in line and behave the way that we should for the benefit of the group. And if we didn't feel guilt and shame, then we would hurt the group and hurt other people and not care about it. And that would be very counterproductive to having a cooperative working group of people. So I don't think that those things are necessarily some supernatural soul conscience thing that's like this moral accountability before God. I think that it makes a lot of sense that those things would naturally arise as a way to help human beings cooperate with each other, and that mixing with, like, our empathy and just general caring about one another and wanting to see each other succeed, I think it makes a lot of sense that, like, we feel a lot of guilt when we hurt other people, because we don't want to hurt other people, and we also don't want to alienate ourselves from the group by being somebody who causes problems for the group. So, like, there's going to be a lot of negative emotion wrapped up in doing things that are immoral, because it's not good for us and it's not good for the group. So, linguistically, when it comes to the whole concept of should or shouldn't, I know that C.S. Lewis kind of talks about this idea of, like, ought to, and how there's not a logical way really to arrive at it. And I disagree with him, I guess, and that's kind of where some of this is going, and why I called it should and shouldn't, because I think it's funny that linguistically we use the word should in two ways, and one of them is morally, which is, you shouldn't commit murder, and we're just like, you shouldn't do it because it's immoral. And then we say that there's this other way where it's like, we use the word should to denote what needs to happen in order to accomplish a certain goal. So if you want to save money, if the goal is to save money, then you should avoid spending money on things you don't need. And so should is qualifying the steps that would have to be taken in order to meet the required goal. Or take the required steps to meet the goal. And so I think that it kind of makes sense that there's not necessarily a necessary distinction there. That, like, if morality is kind of this manifestation of how to fulfill our desires, and again, not individualistically, but like our desires being represented by our personal well-being and the well-being of the whole group, then it makes sense that things that are moral are things where it's like, if we want to preserve the well-being of the individuals and the group as a whole, then we should therefore behave in certain ways, or not behave in certain other ways. So, like, if if you want to feel good about yourself, if you don't want to feel like a piece of crap, and if you have empathy for others and you want to live in community with other people and benefit from that community, then you shouldn't commit murder. Because if you commit murder, you're probably going to feel like a horrible piece of crap, and nobody's going to want you in the community anymore. And yeah, so it's just like, it's completely irrational. Like, there's no rational reason for somebody to commit murder. There's, like, is there anybody out there who's like, man, I just really want to commit murder? It's like, the only people out there who are like that are like serial killers, and they don't have empathy. Which, for me, is another, like, moral conundrum if you're trying to be spiritual about it. Like, yeah, anyway. So, on the other hand, if we're going to use the word should to qualify essential behavior for reaching outcomes, if you're not concerned about the consequences, then there's no rational reason to say that you shouldn't do something. And even on top of that, it's like, going back to my whole thing about how, like, an agent can't behave unless they have some internally programmed motive for behaving that way. Therefore, you wouldn't commit murder unless committing murder was somehow manifesting some internal program you had. I think a lot of times when empathetic people commit murder, they're doing it because it's from a sense of self-preservation and a misunderstanding of the world. And then when serial killers do it, it's because it brings them pleasure and they have absolutely no empathy and they just don't care about other people. So they just do it because their only program is pleasure. And the fact that we're not all sociopaths, but that we actually care about each other is like exactly like the difference between that more than anything is empathy. We care about each other. So kind of important, and also why it's very obvious to me that human beings are not selfish and that we're not naturally inclined to doing immoral things. We don't want to, and when we do, we feel bad about it, and we don't like feeling bad. So, yeah. So, that covers should and shouldn't and general ideas around morality, and as you can see, we're getting really close to the end. Just exciting. So, what do you want? So, I kind of covered already what human beings in general want, and I covered those 5 major categories. And for you, as an individual human being, a lot of those things are still true. Actually, not are still true. It is almost certain, unless you're like a sociopath or something. And, you know, I don't want to be dismissive or rude. There are a lot of other mental illnesses and stuff where the degree to which those 5 things are true might be a little bit different, and that's okay. I'm not judging anybody, and, you know, it is the way that it is. But generally, for most human beings, those 5 things are going to be the most important elements in you being happy and feeling good about yourself and your life. I wanted to put this out there. If agents are slaves, quote, to their desires, are we without choice or any kind of free will? And I guess I already kind of talked about this briefly, but I think that it's healthy to understand that human beings are programmed to get frustrated when they don't have control over the things that they need to be in control over to meet their desires. And I think this is important to understand because within, like, if you think about science and you think about the biology of the brain too much, it can very quickly start to feel like we're out of control and that everything is predetermined, and then therefore, you know, why try anything, and it makes us feel hopeless. But I think that that's an unhelpful way of thinking about it. I think a more helpful way of understanding is that our frustration of feeling out of control has to do with, like, relationship to whether we can get what we want. And so we can't control what it is that we want. We can't control the fact that in order to feel happy and fulfilled, we have to have those 5 things. Like, we don't get to choose that. That was chosen for us before we were born. But that's fine. Like, as a human being, we're not programmed to care about that. What we care about is that if I do X, I can get Y. And we can. We do have the power to do that. And so feel empowered and know that even if, in a bigger sense, in a game like Minecraft, everything is programmed and somewhat predetermined technically, we don't actually care about that. We're not programmed to care about that. We're just programmed to want to within the program that we're living in, if that is what we're living in. We just want to know that we can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. And we can. We have the tools, we have the mind, we have the ability to accomplish what we want. So, and yeah, experientially, like the way we're experiencing the world is that we have a choice. So whether we actually do or don't in the bigger existential sense is somewhat irrelevant. And one example I wanted to use is actually when, I don't know if other people experience this, but I experience this. I assume other people do, or at least a lot of other people do. When there's a machine like a car and it's making funny noises, or like my computer sometimes overheats, it kind of, like we project onto the thing that it's frustrated. Or like I project onto the thing that is frustrated. Or that it's like working extra hard. I feel like that vocabulary is used sometimes when like the fan comes on and it's like, man, I'm working the computer really hard. And there's kind of this level where it's almost like when it starts to go wrong, when the really weird bad sound starts to happen, like in the car and it's going to break down, there's kind of this like projection onto the car that like the car is frustrated, that the sound is like a manifestation of the frustration of the vehicle not being able to accomplish what it's supposed to be accomplishing. And so even though the purpose of the vehicle is completely straightforward and very pre-cut and almost predetermined, as it were, the frustration is not from the lack of greater control of what it was created to do, but is only a frustration with regards to its inability to function the way that it's supposed to be functioning. So it makes sense that as human beings we're programmed to feel frustrated when we're not working right, because that motivates us to want to fix things, and we can fix things. So again, be empowered. Yeah, we have a lot of power to make changes in our lives. It just takes intentionality, knowledge, and determination. And, of course, vision. Vision provides concrete goals, which help us to feel good, which help us to feel in control, because we can measure our progress. Concrete goals are incredibly important to feeling in control, because not, blurry goals, we can't tell if we're actually meeting them or not. So, vision is where we develop better wants for ourselves, referring, of course, back to when I made the distinguishment between our core essential actual programmed wants and then all the things that we think that we want. So with vision, we can start getting down to what are the things that we should want in order to accomplish our greatest wants. I guess I'm reiterating a lot of stuff, but we can't change our wants away from our core desires, but we can change our wants away from what won't fulfill us toward wants that will fulfill us. This is going to tie a little bit back to the morality thing, where we have an automatic tendency to think that human beings are hedonistic and selfish. So I think that a lot of times when you ask somebody what do they want, it's funny that the first things people are almost always going to say are things that correlate to somewhat selfish and hedonistic type things. So it's like, but the reason that we do that is because we don't want negative emotion and we do want positive emotion. So if we're in a situation where we're experiencing negative emotion and you ask somebody what they want is to not be in that negative emotion anymore as quickly as possible. And even if they're not necessarily in a specifically terrible place of negative emotion, they do want also positive emotion. And if they're not experiencing positive emotion, it's exactly what they want. Although most of the time, I would say people want positive emotion to offset negative emotion. However it goes, we think that we want money, or that we want power, or that we want romantic relationships, or traveling, or adventure, or, quote, doing what we love, and not working, of course. These are all really just like attempts to get rid of negative emotions and to generate positive emotions. But all of these things are misunderstandings of how to get those things. And it's not entirely just misunderstanding, though. It's partly that the path is always hard and long. It's not short and fun. And our conscious brain has the capacity to be like, I can endure pain for the long term. Our subconscious brain doesn't like that so much, and it resists a lot. And so we have a lot of internal resistance to making long-term plans for our happiness, because it's not always conducive to our immediate in the moment happiness. The question is whether we're willing to commit ourselves to that, and whether we're willing to be like, you know what? It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for right now, but like, I want to live a whole life of fulfillment, and I want to live a life of making a positive change in the world and leaving a legacy rather than living my whole life playing this game of escape where I constantly try to get rid of negative emotions in the moment by short-term positive emotions in the moment that go away really fast and then I'm a negative emotion again. It's this game that we can play, and we can spend our whole lives playing that game of let's get rid of negative emotion with short-term pleasure, or we can start engaging in this more visionary, big picture version of our lives where we have a bigger thing that we want to be, a bigger thing that we want to do, and we're willing to subject ourselves to some uncomfortability and short-term suffering in order to get somewhere where we have a more permanent sense of happiness and fulfillment that short-term pleasure can't ever really seem to bring. So, getting really close to the end here, what do you want? That is a very interesting question, and I can't answer that for you, but you can answer it for yourself. Do you want to live a life focused on a bigger vision and finding meaning and fulfillment? Or do you want to live your whole life trying to escape negative emotion? And I have no judgment for you either way, but I think wisdom would say that people who make the decision to do the hard things never regret it. So I highly doubt you would regret it either, and it's probably going to be worth it. Almost certainly it'll be worth it. So finishing up, very close here at the end. What is the path to flourishing? I have just kind of a list that I'm going to go through. So listening to wisdom is going to be a huge part to the path to flourishing. I don't think there's a way around that. And the secular world, maybe they call it something different. And since I'm just coming out of Christianity, I call it wisdom. But in my experience with the secular world, there's a lot of wisdom lacking. There's a lot of emphasis on individualism and not a lot of emphasis on these things that Martin Seligman is talking about. And even the field of positive psychology, I feel like it's kind of under the radar right now. But seek wisdom. It's not easy to find. It's worth looking for, though. Becoming self-confident, overcoming insecurities, counseling. For me, this has been a huge part of moving forward in my life. So tons of our negative emotions come from traumas, and as I referred to in the earlier presentation about incorrectly subconscious programs for feeling certain ways about the world that are inaccurate. We get all sorts of those growing up, and you can fix them or you can leave them inaccurate. And the problem is that if you leave them inaccurate, then you're setting yourself up for a long road of negative emotion your whole life, for feeling emotions that are not accurately reflecting where you're at or what you're doing. You'll accomplish great things and not feel proud of them, and that sucks. You'll have people who absolutely love hanging out with you, and yet you'll feel like they don't like hanging out with you. You have relationships, but you don't feel like you have relationships. All of those core things to flourishing, the only way for you to feel like you have them is to have a really good emotional calibration to feeling good when you do have them and not feeling good when you don't have them. Because it can even go the other way. And he mentions this in the book, that you can think that you have meaning and you actually don't. There's a way to objectively decide that what you're doing is not actually contributing to the greater good. And so you want to be in tune to those things. And my personal recommendation for starters is counseling. Great place to start emotionally processing where you're at. And counselors are basically trained to help you recalibrate your emotions to be accurate. And they will challenge your inaccurate calibrations, and then you're going to have to do the work to do the conscious rethinking and reprogramming. But you totally got it. You can do it. It's so funny, all the times I've gone to counseling, counselors are always confused because I'm so aware of why I'm there, and most people aren't necessarily. But it was still always been incredibly helpful for me. It's I wasn't going because I was dealing with any kind of mental illness or anything, but I was just going because it's the more I deal with my emotional traumas from growing up, the happier I am, and I like being happy. So I just kept going back to counseling, and it's yeah, highly recommend going to counseling. Deal with your emotions, man, or woman, or whatever you call yourself, deal with your emotions. It's great. It makes you happy, and life as a whole just becomes a lot brighter when you deal with inside of you. Because no matter what happens on the outside, if you're seeing darkness because of these dark glasses you have on, no amount of brightness on the outside will ever make those dark glasses go away. So figure out how to make those go away. It's going to be hard. It's going to be complicated and scary, but like, again, totally worth it. Healthy relationships. Having friends and mentors where you feel safe and understood and you feel like people care about you and they like you and they want you to be around. Incredibly important. If you don't have this in your life, man, that's really rough. And I don't say that sarcastically or flippantly. I've felt that way before. Not as bad as some people probably have, but like there have been times in my life when I felt really alone and when I didn't feel like I could trust people. And it's a really hard thing and it's no fun at all. But there are ways of getting out of that. And again, the path is long and hard. It's not easy and straightforward and snap your fingers, it's fixed. But a lot of times starting with counseling is going to be a great place and they'll help you figure that out. And there are going to be some other ways of doing that. And potentially finding wise adults in your life to talk to about that's going to be a place to start as well. But there are ways to start, and healthy relationships are critical to a happy, healthy life. Learning about wellness. I talked about how there's a lot of power in knowledge. So like, read books, watch videos. YouTube is an incredible resource these days. So many great content creators creating all sorts of videos. You have to be maybe a little bit careful to find people who actually know what they're talking about. But overall, learning about wellness is going to be powerful. There's no excuse to not be learning about it if you want to know about it, because it's so easy access. So easy to access good content about almost anything that you might want to know about health and wellness. This one comes a little bit back to the counseling thing, but it's a little bit different. Listening to your emotions is really about learning how to, like, when that unconscious-conscious mind interaction is happening, if your conscious mind can actually make up for the fact that the unconscious mind doesn't have words. And the only way to do that is to pay attention to what's happening in the unconscious mind and then to practice describing it with words. And the 2 steps to that is, 1, you have to be paying attention to how you feel, which means you have to not be paying attention to other things. You can't be paying attention to how you feel if you're talking to another person, or if you're watching a movie, or if you're riding a bike. Like, there's a certain point at which to really be in tune with how you're feeling, you just have to like sit down and do nothing. And that's kind of what meditation is about. It's about not doing anything so that you can just like look inwardly and to like pay attention to how you feel. And then emotional processing is about after you felt the emotions that you felt when you're doing something like meditation, you go and you practice putting words to it by going and talking to other people about how you feel when certain things happen. And you can also do emotional processing even if you don't do meditation, because we do feel things throughout the busyness of our lives anyway. Process that stuff too, and do it with healthy friendships, people who listen to you and don't judge you. Physical health. This is a hard one in the American lifestyle, but it's worth looking into. And I mean, everybody has to make a decision about where they want balance in their life, but I promise you that getting enough sleep, eating well, and exercising, those are the things that make it so that when you wake up in the morning, you're like, man, I feel great. If your current experience is not that, I highly recommend trying to get that kind of experience. I think that it's really hard to absolutely love your life and to be excited on a daily basis if when you're waking up in the morning, you feel really bad. And at least for me in my own personal experience, every time I've made an adjustment to be healthier, the contrast is so dramatic for me that like I can't ever imagine going back. I'm just like, before I take the step, I'm like, how, like, is it really worth it? But then as soon as I take the step, I'm like, man, there's no going back. So highly recommend it. But do what you will. One thing I will put out here is don't overwhelm yourself. Pick one thing at a time and just kind of subtly, carefully integrate them. And again, that's where it takes a long time. getting well, you can't just in the matter of a month fix all of these things. And again, I would start with the counseling thing. It's an incredible first place to start for anything. Don't fix anything else in your life. Don't fix your physical health. Don't try meditating. Start with going to counseling. And once that becomes a regular part of your life, then you can start thinking about another thing on this list that you might start working on. I've been working on a ton of these things, and I started probably when I was, I don't know when I started. I've been obsessed about these things my whole life, so I've kind of been doing them my whole life. But especially within the last 4 or 5 years, I've been very intentional about trying to do these things, and I'm making slow progress, but I tend to hinder my progress when I try to do too many at a time. So don't do them all at once. This is kind of a higher one. You can't really define your values or set a life vision if you don't know how you feel when you do certain things, or you don't know how to articulate emotions, or it's at least going to make it hard. But at some point along the way, being able to define and understand what it is that's really important to you and the things in life that make you feel really good and that give you positive emotions, whether it's teaching or creating or all sorts of things, being able to define what's most important to you and creating a really well-defined life vision is going to be essential to having clear decision-making criteria for all the areas of your life. Even physical health and relationships are going to come into focus much more vividly if you have a bigger long-term plan for yourself. Strategizing for reducing stress and gaining power in your life. This I'd actually put kind of toward the beginning if I were to prioritize them. Still after counseling. Counseling's still highest priority for everybody. Go to counseling. You don't think you need counseling, but you need counseling. So please go to counseling. But strategizing for reducing stress and gaining power in your life. In my own life, those have constantly gone hand in hand, where this is kind of a random slide that I threw in here, but people are constantly giving me crap about personality tests. Everybody has their favorite one, whether it's Enneagram or what's it called? The MBTI. But I just want to clarify this for everybody who's super obsessed with personality tests. Okay. I don't have a problem with you and think how you want. I don't want to pop your bubble or anything. But I have a personal empathetic investment in helping people to understand the reality around personality tests. So this is my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, and psychology people definitely feel free to correct me if you feel like I'm misunderstanding this. But as far as I can tell, personality is mostly about temperament and not complex behaviors. So our inborn characteristics that are true for us tend to be orientations toward behaving a certain way, not predispositions to behave a certain way. So introversion and extroversion are a temperament. They're an orientation. If you're extroverted, like me, I'm extremely extroverted, you seek a ton of stimulation. But seeking stimulation is an extremely broad thing. And for tons of different extroverts, the way that extroversion plays out is going to be dramatically different, depending on a bunch of other characteristics that they have. And it also depends a lot on just choices that they make and what they decide to value and what they decide to do. There's a lot of decision making involved with our temperaments. And so personality tests are not who we'll always be because it's how we were born. Most of those personality tests like MBTI and Enneagram and stuff, what they're measuring is who we currently are. So they're measuring how we currently behave, but we have a ton of freedom and ability to become somebody who behaves differently. And some of those behaviors aren't necessarily good or bad, but depending on what you value in life and who you want to be and where you want to go, getting caught on thinking that you have to be this person is completely unhelpful. You should be focused on who you want to be, of course, without being morally critical of who you currently are. You have to accept who you are, but accept that who you are should change and that changing is going to make you happier. Don't get stuck on who you think you currently are and thinking that it's always going to be that way. It doesn't have to be, and hopefully that's hopeful, because I'm really glad that I get to learn and change and become more responsible and become healthier in relationships. And to learn how to have healthy relationships and not think that there's certain weaknesses that I'm just always going to have. It's like, nope, I'm learning how to deal with them and not have those anymore. We have incredible capacity to grow and change our behaviors. Yeah, and so it's like, at the end of the day, and this is why I say, like, there's no moral judgment involved. It's just like, you're the only one who's ever going to feel you. And you kind of have to make the decision for yourself. Like, is feeling the way that you feel the way that you want to feel? And if it is, I mean, great, stick with it. But in my life, I have made incredible growth in changing toward ways that have made me much happier. And all the pain and hard work and effort that it took for me has always been completely worth it. And so I encourage people to change and to grow. I think it's always worth it. And yeah, find people who fully accept you, but also want you to grow to be happier. So don't make friends with people who need you to be different, but be friends with people who are okay with who you are and can be your friend for who you are right now and don't need you to be different, but they also have your best interest in mind and they want to see you grow and change and they want to help you on that journey to grow and become better. This is a chart, so some of these last ideas are a little scattered, I guess, but this is the 24 virtues, and basically, in the whole positive psychology thing, you have those 5 major categories, right, of relationships, and I always have a hard time listing them all off. So you have positive emotion, engagement, meaning, achievement, and relationships. You have those 5 things, and those 5 things are the core essence of human beings being at their maxed fulfillment and flourishing. But within that research, these are what they call the 24 virtues, and basically these are characteristics that they observed to exist in all human beings. And again, technically that's not going to be true because you're going to have people like sociopaths who don't necessarily have a sense of love. And that's going to undermine their ability to feel half of these things like gratitude and humility. But for the general human population, pretty much everybody has these 24 things in all cultures and all parts of the world. And these are the things that like contribute and create those 5 big things. So things like love and kindness and social intelligence are going to contribute to your ability to have positive relationships. But I mean, the main reason I just included this in here is like when it comes to like morality and ethics, and technically from the atheist perspective, there's not really a whole lot of distinguishment between those 2 words, but it's like these are the things that like create human flourishing and happiness and well-being. It's not seeking pleasure and doing whatever comes to mind immediately. It's about wisdom. Like these 24 things, I think, are where a lot of wisdom happens. So like those 5 big things, those seem like, oh yeah, of course, like we want positive emotion and we want engagement and we want achievement, we want relationships, but it's like, what do those look like so that they're providing us that fulfillment and that happiness? And I think these 24 things here are where that's coming from. It's from gratitude and optimism and self-control and forgiveness and teamwork and open-mindedness and being curious. Which is funny, those are 2 different ones. Huh. I was thinking they were the same in my mind. But yeah, and I think this picture is beautiful, and being somebody who absolutely loves wisdom, like all of the things in this picture just like make me smile and so happy. And I'm like, these are all the things that I would love to be. Like when you look at these, wouldn't you love for anybody to say that like these describe you, that you're a person of gratitude, that you're socially intelligent, that you have integrity, that you have perseverance, that you're brave, that you're creative? Like these are the things that we want to be. And so like be these things. People who are these things like feel proud of who they are. So again, when it comes to the whole personality thing, it's like we can all become more of this. According to the social scientists and the psychologists who did the research, they found these characteristics in everybody, assuming you're an empathetic person. So yeah, so look at this and just like, it's beautiful. I love it. Another part of the like knowing yourself is about knowing your values. That's going to be a huge part of determining your life vision. And this is just a picture of a values test that I took at one point. And it was funny because in the results of this test, they actually mentioned how here those like the ones on the top that are green and blue, and then, of course, I guess the two that kind of drop below the center, achievement and humility. Achievement, humility, and everything above, they were like, people who value those things tend to be a lot happier in life than the people who value the things on the bottom. And it's like, well, based on the thing we were just looking at with the 24 virtues, and then also like the 5 fundamental elements of human happiness and flourishing, it completely makes sense that like the people more concerned about the feelings of others and being humble and even like stimulation and health, like those contribute to happiness, and achievement contributes to happiness, with of course hedonism being a strange one, but I guess that's like positive emotion in some way. But then the things down at the bottom where you're like holding on to being personally safe and your own individual security and how you look and your power, like those don't contribute to people actually being happy and flourishing. And so people who value those things too much aren't necessarily going to be happy, because it's not how human beings are programmed. So, and then I think this is my last visual. It's maybe a misrepresentation of what Ikigai is actually even supposed to be. When I was looking up the picture, it looked like some people were like, this is a complete misrepresentation, because it's a Japanese life philosophy kind of idea. But regardless of, maybe this is completely inaccurate, but this is still kind of like pointing in that direction of like human happiness and flourishing in a practical sense is going to come from acknowledging the things you don't have control over, like what you can get paid for, you can't necessarily control all the time, and what the world needs, you can't necessarily control, or what you're even good at, you can't necessarily control. And technically, maybe you can't control what you love, but like you love what you love, and you're good at what you're good at, and then the world needs things, and you need money to be able to make it in life. So finding a way to like strategically integrate those is going to be part of living a happy life, and being intentional about that, and not just doing what people told you you should do, but actually thinking about yourself and listening to your emotions and paying attention to what you're actually good at and what actually you enjoy doing. Those are going to be important. So that is everything. And goodness, that's not nearly as structured and organized as I hope to have it one day, but this is just the beginning. These are my preliminary ideas. This is the beginning of my journey to define a philosophy that is hopefully practical and useful and helps human beings to understand how they work and who they are and where their place in the world is. Hopefully it wasn't confusing being a little bit all over the place. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something that was of value and importance. To kind of give just like an overall summary, I at the last second thought this might be helpful. Because surprisingly, everything that I just went through, a ton of information. But if I were to just like really simplify it down, this is basically all it is. You are an agent, you want to feel good, and you care about other people. You have choices to make in your life, which will determine how you feel and how you impact others. So, you want to feel good, you want to care about others, and you have the capacity to do something about it. So over the course of your life, are you going to do something about it? And you have the ability to choose to seek wisdom and knowledge, and you can choose to learn how to listen to your body. And if you do those things, you will maximize your potential to experience positive emotions and have a positive impact on other people. And then one day you're going to die. And all that's left is the results of those decisions you made. So if you decided not to go down that hard path to grow and to learn and to change, and you didn't maximize your potential to have a positive impact on the world and on other people, well, one day you're going to die, and you're not going to leave a whole lot behind. And if you did have some like hedonistic, you had pleasure and stuff, all of that dies with you, and nobody remembers it except you. But if you put in that work and you grow and you become more mature and you become more emotionally healthy, and then you're going to be happier, and you're going to make other people happier, and then after you pass and you die, hopefully you will have left some things behind for the world, whether it was just making the impact in one other person's life, and then when they become a parent, they're a better parent than they would have otherwise been. Or maybe you write a book and a few people read it, or hundreds and thousands of people read it, but like they read what you learned, they learned your wisdom from your experience, and it makes their lives better. So, overall summary, you're a human being, you're born into the world, and you have power and capacity to change something, and you have choices to change something, and you have a very short time to do it because one day you're going to die. So, you have a chance to do something. That's my most fundamental understanding of myself and my life, is like, I have a chance to do something. And if I have a chance to do something, I'm totally going to take it. I was going to do a quick look at my life. These are, if you want to just like look at them, these are the things over the last 5 or 6 years I've been extremely consciously proactive in trying to change, or things that I've been doing to elicit change in my life. And all of them have been incredibly helpful, and it's taken a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of struggle, but I'm making strides, I would say, in my life these days, and I'm happier than I've ever been, and I absolutely love my life. And here at the bottom I say, I'm exceedingly grateful. I am so incredibly grateful for everything that I've been gifted in life, or that I have life, and that I have this mind to understand things. And if I died tomorrow, like, I'm not attached. Like, I'm so happy for the life that I have. I don't need anything else to be happy. If I had to work the job that I have now for the rest of my life, I could still be happy. If, like, the friends that I have, they're incredible. I don't need better friends. I would like some atheist friends. It'd be pretty nice. But I don't need them. Like, the friends that I have, they're good enough. They're incredible people. I love them. And like my family, they're incredible. They're not perfect. My friends aren't perfect. Nobody's perfect. But they're good enough. They're incredible. They're human, and I'm a human, and I'm not perfect. And I don't need something more than what I have. What I have is great, and I'm grateful for it, and I'm so happy. So, the most important thing to finish off with is that I'm going to have a live stream to answer questions that you have about everything that I just went through. And I guess that was a ton to go through. But I will be answering questions at 3 p.m. This is my time. This is Central Standard Time in the U.S. So if you want to ask your questions by calling in, which I'd absolutely love to have at least a few people call in live, message me. And I'm about to let you know how to message me. But message me and let me know. And we'll find a time that works for you, hopefully between 3 and 4, because that's when I'm going to be doing the live stream. And I would love to live answer some of your questions. It'd be incredible. And then, yeah, the link is going to be in the description for this video of how to get to the live stream, assuming I figure out how to do that by the time I publish this video. And then, yeah, so to send me questions or to message me about calling in, there's my email, there's my phone number, and you can also message me direct on Facebook and WhatsApp. Please don't use Instagram because I don't get notifications half the time for messages on that. And yeah, please call in. Please message me about calling in. I would absolutely love it. And also, please don't randomly call in. So that is all. That is everything. It was so much. And let me tell you, it's taken me so much work to get this far. And I'm sorry that it was so chaotic and disorganized. I am excited for a time in the future when I'll get this more organized. But the pressure of making this event happen got me to a place where I organized it at least that much, which is leaps and bounds ahead of where I was even just a week ago. I'm amazed at how the intense pressure this week, as stressful as it was, I got so much done. I got so far in articulating this idea. So I'm so incredibly excited about it. I'm excited to hear people's questions and responses, and I'm excited for my life in philosophy and psychology and everything I have to learn yet, and all the edits and revisions I'm going to make to this in the future. So please join me for the live stream, and thank you if you listen to this whole thing and you're still listening to this part. Goodness, you are a patient, attentive person. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful rest of your life. Be grateful. I appreciate you, and that is all for now. Goodbye.